What would it look like if the largest trading partnership in modern history quietly crumbled in exactly 1 week? And why is the entire media still treating it like a routine story? Before we go any further, do me one small favor that genuinely keeps this kind of reporting alive. Tap that like button right now, hit subscribe with the bell turned on, and share this with one friend who still believes the trade war is somebody else's problem. It takes about 5 seconds, and it directly decides whether we can keep covering stories like this without tiptoeing around them. Now back to what is actually happening inside a building in Washington most people will never see. On Tuesday afternoon of this week, inside the headquarters of the United States Trade Representative, a senior Canadian cabinet minister sat down with America's top trade envoy for the third time in 21 days. Not the second time, not a routine follow-up. The third face-to-face meeting between the same two negotiating teams in less than a month. The kind of pace you only ever see when a calendar deadline is closing in, and both sides understand the math. The meeting was scheduled to run about 30 minutes. It ran a full 60. And when Dominic LeBlanc walked out of that building, he did not stop to take a single question from the reporters gathered outside. He stepped into a waiting car, pulled away, and roughly an hour later posted 11 carefully chosen words on social media. Discussions are ongoing. We continue to engage at the negotiation table. That is the entire public footprint of what may be one of the most consequential trade meetings between Canada and the United States in an entire generation. And the silence surrounding it is not an oversight. It is a deliberate signal. To read that signal properly, you have to understand what is set to happen 1 week from today, on August 19th, at exactly 1 minute past midnight Eastern Time, when a tariff order sitting on the president's desk automatically switches on, whether anyone in Washington wants it to or not. Let us rewind, because the timeline here is more important than almost any other detail in the entire story. On July 20th of this year, President Trump signed 3 separate presidential proclamations. Not one, 3. Each one invoking a long dormant provision of American trade law called Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930. A statute so old and so rarely dusted off that trade lawyers across Washington have spent the past several weeks calling it almost unanimously something close to the last clear tool still left on the shelf. Section 338 allows a sitting president to impose additional duties of up to 50% on any country found to be discriminating against American commerce. And unlike nearly every other tariff lever Trump has pulled across the past 18 months, Section 338 duties are not temporary. They are not tied to an emergency declaration that any court can later strike down. They do not expire automatically on a clock. They simply remain in place indefinitely until a future president actively chooses to remove them. On July 20th, that mechanism was pointed directly at 3 specific sectors of the Canadian economy: motor vehicles, alcoholic beverages, and dairy. Taken together, these 3 proclamations cover close to $20 billion in Canadian goods crossing into the United States every single year. The motor vehicle proclamation alone covers 439 separate tariff classifications, everything from finished cars and trucks down to specific components and parts. In 2024, the United States imported more than $19 billion worth of goods under just that single tariff list. The alcohol proclamation covers 63 classifications worth roughly $1 billion a year. And if you assume that only touches wine and whiskey, you are missing the fine print. Inside the annex of that same proclamation sits language covering certain wood products, certain paper products, and for reasons that still puzzle even seasoned trade analysts, hockey sticks. Hockey equipment quietly sitting inside a tariff order supposedly about alcohol. The dairy proclamation is smaller in dollar terms, but it carries its own political weight because it strikes directly at Canada's supply management system, the mechanism that controls how much foreign dairy can enter the Canadian market and at what price. A system Canadian farmers have defended for decades. Successive Canadian governments have promised publicly, repeatedly, and on the record never to touch. Now here's the detail that should genuinely stop you cold if you understand how trade law is supposed to work. Normally, when 2 countries share a free trade agreement, and the United States, Mexico, and Canada absolutely do, goods that qualify under that agreement's rules of origin are supposed to be exempt from unilateral tariffs like this one. That is the entire purpose of a trade agreement. It is supposed to function as a shield, except these new tariffs explicitly do not care about that shield. The Section 338 duties apply to Canadian goods regardless of whether they qualify for preferential treatment under USMCA. And let that fact settle in for a moment. The very free trade agreement that Donald Trump himself renegotiated and signed during his first term, the deal he once called the best trade deal ever made, provides zero protection against the tariffs he personally signed in July. a car assembled in Windsor, Ontario, with parts crossing the border multiple times, exactly the way the agreement was designed to allow, will be hit with the same 50% duty as a car built anywhere else in the world with no North American content at all. On this specific point, the agreement that was supposed to anchor the entire North American trading relationship has been rendered functionally meaningless. That single fact goes a long way toward explaining why the mood inside the negotiating rooms in Washington has shifted over the past few weeks from cautious hope to something much closer to open alarm. And the clock is doing the rest of the talking. Now let us talk about the countdown, because the countdown is the entire story at this hour. August 19th, 1 minute past midnight, Eastern Time, 7 days from today. That is not a soft deadline subject to political mood or a friendly phone call. It is a legally binding effective date written into 3 signed presidential proclamations that trigger automatically unless something changes it before the clock runs out. And what makes this moment feel different from every other tariff deadline that has come and gone over the past 18 months is the sheer density of activity happening in the 7 days immediately preceding it. 3 meetings between these 2 negotiating teams in 3 weeks. Not phone calls, not video conferences, face-to-face meetings inside. The actual headquarters of the United States Trade Representative. The kind of meetings that require flights, translators on standby, thick briefing books prepared in advance, and senior officials clearing their calendars on both sides of the border. Last Thursday, Dominic LeBlanc and Canada's chief trade negotiator, a career diplomat named Janice Charette, sat down with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer for what multiple industry sources later described to reporters as a constructive and detailed meeting. LeBlanc himself posted about it publicly using exactly those words, constructive and detailed, and said the Canadian focus remained on striking a comprehensive deal that addresses sectoral tariffs and benefits Canadian workers, farmers, and businesses. Multiple industry sources told reporters afterward they were, in their own words, cautiously optimistic that real progress was being made. Then came Monday. LeBlanc had planned to fly back to Washington to keep that momentum alive, but his flight was diverted back to Montreal because of severe weather, a small, almost absurd detail in the middle of an otherwise high-stakes diplomatic sprint. The kind of thing that reminds you these negotiations are still, underneath all the legal language and tariff schedules, run by human beings dealing with grounded planes and weather systems they cannot control. While LeBlanc was stuck rerouting, Charette did not wait. She spent the entire day in Washington on her own, meeting directly with officials inside the office of the U.S. Trade Representative, making sure the Canadian side lost no ground just because one plane got grounded. And then, on Tuesday, the meeting we opened with, LeBlanc finally made it down, walked into USTR headquarters with Charette at 1:30 in the afternoon for what was officially scheduled as a 30-minute check-in, and instead turned into a full hour of closed-door negotiation. When it wrapped, neither LeBlanc nor Charette said a single word to the press waiting outside. In this specific context, that silence is not nothing. Diplomats whose negotiations went badly tend to say something anyway, even something carefully hedged. Something that quietly manages expectations downward so nobody gets blindsided later. Diplomats whose negotiations are genuinely close to landing tend to say almost nothing at all because every public word risks upsetting a fragile balance that has not yet been finalized. The silence after Tuesday's meeting reads far closer to the second category than the first. If you have made it this far with me, you clearly want the deeper story, not just the headlines, so do this. Drop a comment below telling me what you think is actually going to happen on August 19th. I read every single one, and the sharpest takes might get featured in the next video. Now let us talk about what is actually being negotiated, because this is the part that consistently gets lost in the headlines about deadlines and tariffs. According to reporting on the substance of these talks, there are specific concrete trade-offs on the table on both sides. Canada is reportedly offering to remove its own counter-tariffs on American-made automobiles, the retaliatory measures Ottawa imposed in response to Trump's original tariffs going back to early last year. On the alcohol front, the conversation centers on provincial liquor board restrictions, the rules that several Canadian provinces put in place, limiting which American wines and spirits end up on their store shelves. A policy the Distilled Spirits Council of the United States has publicly described as devastating, pointing to a 63% collapse in American alcohol exports to Canada over the past year alone. On dairy, the two sides are reportedly exchanging proposals about how Canada manages its tariff rate quotas, the mechanism at the very heart of the supply management system, without necessarily dismantling the system altogether. That distinction matters enormously to Canadian farmers watching this process with real anxiety about their livelihoods. Here's the trap sitting underneath all 3 of those proposals, though, and it is worth pausing on because it helps explain why this is taking 3 meetings in 3 weeks and still is not done. Every single one of those three issues, autos, alcohol, and dairy, is not just an economic dispute. Each one is politically radioactive in its own specific way inside Canada. Removing counter tariffs on American autos means Canadian officials have to walk back, a measure they publicly justified as necessary retaliation, a move Trump's own tariffs supposedly forced them into in the first place. Loosening the provincial alcohol restrictions means overriding decisions made not by the federal government in Ottawa, but by individual provincial governments, some of which have shown zero appetite for backing down, because those restrictions play well domestically as a symbol of standing up to Washington. And any change to dairy tariff rate quotas, no matter how technical or how carefully it tries to avoid touching the core structure of supply management, risks being portrayed by opposition politicians and by dairy farmers themselves as the first visible crack in a system Canadian governments have sworn for generations to protect completely. This is the internal contradiction sitting at the heart of the negotiations. To get a deal that satisfies Washington, Canadian negotiators need to make domestic concessions that carry real political risk back home. And they need to make those concessions inside a 7-day window with almost no room left for the kind of slow, careful, incremental trust building that trade negotiations usually rely on. Now let us widen the lens for a moment, because the auto, alcohol, and dairy tariffs are not the only fire currently burning in this relationship. And understanding the full scope of what has accumulated over the past 18 months is essential to understanding why this specific week feels different from every other deadline that has come and gone. This trade war did not start in July. It started back on February 1st, 2025, when Trump first announced sweeping tariffs on Canadian goods, 25% on most imports, 10% specifically on Canadian energy products, citing the threat of fentanyl trafficking across the northern border as his legal justification under emergency powers. Canada responded almost immediately with retaliatory tariffs of its own, beginning with roughly $30 billion in targeted American goods and escalating within 3 weeks to cover as much as $155 billion in retaliatory measures. Tariff and counter-tariff, back and forth, for the better part of a year and a half. Then, in February of this year, the U.S. Supreme Court actually struck down a significant chunk of Trump's original emergency tariffs, ruling in a case called Learning Resources versus Trump that the specific legal authority he had been using, something called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, did not actually give him the power to impose sweeping tariffs the way he had claimed. That ruling should have been a turning point. In many ways it was, and it is exactly why the administration pivoted in July to Section 338 instead. A completely different, much older legal mechanism that does not rely on the emergency powers law the Supreme Court had just dismantled. Section 338 has essentially never been used this aggressively in the modern era, which is precisely why trade lawyers keep pointing out that it had been sitting on the shelf for nearly a century. The administration reached for it specifically because the courts had just closed off the tool they had been using before. And there is another front in this conflict that gets far less attention than the tariff percentages, but tells you something important about how personal and how petty this dispute has become at the margins. Back in June, the Gordie Howe International Bridge, a massive infrastructure project connecting Windsor, Ontario, and Detroit, Michigan, was supposed to finally open after years of delays. A $6.4 billion undertaking that both governments had spent years planning together. Under the original financing agreement, Canada paid for construction, and toll revenue from the bridge would eventually be split 50-50 with the United States once Canada had first recouped its own construction costs. That was the deal both sides actually signed. Then, right before the scheduled opening, the Trump administration intervened at the last moment, citing what it called unfair trade practices, and blocked the bridge from opening under the original terms. The new arrangement Trump's officials pushed through instead gives the United States 50% of net bridge and crossing revenues for 15 years, starting immediately, which means Canada now takes significantly longer to recover the money it already spent building the thing in the first place. A senator in Washington publicly criticized similar last-minute renegotiation tactics elsewhere in Trump's broader trade approach as, in his words, a bait and switch. Whether or not you agree with that framing, the pattern is documented, verifiable, and it is part of the trust deficit Canadian negotiators are carrying into every single meeting happening this week. This is far and away the most important story of the week, and I want to make sure every single person who cares about understanding what is happening gets to see it. So do me a favor. Take a screenshot of this moment, share it to your story, and tag someone who needs to understand the deadline looming over both countries. The more we get this story outside of politics, the harder it becomes for anyone in power to quietly let August 19th slide past. Now let us bring the human dimension back into focus, because underneath all this legal machinery, Real lives and real livelihoods are sitting in the blast radius, which brings us to a sentence that may end up defining this entire negotiation more than any tariff schedule or any signed proclamation. On July 23rd, speaking to Canada's provincial premiers, Prime Minister Carney said something that should be read as close to a direct statement of Canadian strategy as anything he has said publicly this year. "I have to be convinced," Carney told them, "that any agreement would actually hold up over time." Sit with that phrase for a moment, because it is not boilerplate diplomatic language. It is a Canadian Prime Minister telling his own provincial leaders on the record that Canada's core difficulty right now is not only negotiating better terms, it is whether any terms at all, once signed, can be trusted to mean what they say. And that skepticism did not come from nowhere. It came directly from watching what happened with the Gordie Howe Bridge agreement, and from watching how casually the Section 338 tariffs simply ignored the protections that were supposed to exist under USMCA, the very agreement Trump signed and championed during his first term. If a signed trade agreement providing explicit tariff exemptions can simply be overridden by a new proclamation whenever it is politically convenient, what exactly does a fresh signature guarantee going forward? That is the question sitting underneath every single hour of negotiation happening in Washington this week. And it is not a question tariff percentages alone can answer. Trump, for his part, has been almost strikingly blunt about how little he personally values the broader framework here. On July 28th, speaking by phone to Fox and Friends, he was asked directly whether he had any interest in preserving or updating the USMCA, the very trade agreement structuring the entire North American relationship. "I do not care," Trump said. "I do not really want to. I would rather be independent. Mexico and Canada need us. We do not need them." That statement landed on the exact same morning Canada publicly announced LeBlanc's next trip to Washington, an almost cinematic collision of two contradictory realities happening within hours of each other. Canada racing to keep negotiations alive and moving forward, while the President of the United States was telling a national television audience on the record that the underlying framework holding those negotiations together is not something he particularly cares about preserving at all. So where does that leave the actual economic stakes in real terms for real people on both sides of the border? Because underneath the political theater, there is already genuine, measurable economic damage on the books. Damage that has accumulated regardless of what happens on August 19th. Trump's own trade war has contributed to a roughly 22% drop, around $5.6 billion in Canadian purchases of American-made vehicles between April 2025 and March 2026. Canadian consumers and businesses have quietly shifted their purchasing toward vehicles built in Japan, South Korea, and Mexico instead. That is not a hypothetical future cost. That is money that has already left the American auto industry and gone somewhere else, a shift that will take years to reverse even if a deal gets signed next week. On the Canadian side, one recent economic analysis estimated that the country could lose more than 100,000 jobs if the broader USMCA framework collapses entirely, a number that becomes considerably more real and considerably more urgent depending on what happens in the 7 days ahead. Now, let us talk honestly about the counter-argument, because there is a serious, credible case for why this particular deadline might resolve calmly the way several previous deadlines in this same trade war ultimately did. The strongest version of that argument runs something like this. Both governments have enormous overlapping incentives to avoid a full-blown tariff escalation heading into a politically sensitive period. Trump is heading into November midterms where rising consumer prices, driven partly by his own tariff policy, are already a documented political liability. Prime Minister Carney is heading into a stretch where Canadian economic growth desperately needs stability, not another disruptive shock to major export sectors like autos and dairy. 3 meetings in 3 weeks, a working push to get an actual deal structure in front of Trump before the deadline hits, all of. That reads as two governments working hard, in good faith, toward an actual resolution rather than sleepwalking toward a needless economic collision. Under that reading, the harsher public comments from earlier in the month were theater. Calculated pressure, timed deliberately to soften the other side before a final signature, not a preview of where this is actually headed. That is the strongest, most reasonable case for optimism. And it deserves to be taken seriously because it is grounded in real, documented behavior on both sides this week, not just wishful thinking. But here's why. That optimistic reading runs into a serious structural problem. A problem that no amount of goodwill inside the negotiating room can fully paper over. Section 338, by its own legal design, is fundamentally different from every other tariff tool Trump has used throughout this entire trade war. It is not built around an emergency declaration that expires, or that a court can strike down the way the Supreme Court struck down his original IEPA tariffs back in February. It has no built-in sunset clause, Once it is live, it stays live until a president actively chooses to remove it, which means simply running out the clock, simply letting August 19th arrive without a fully signed agreement on the desk, does not create a temporary problem that quietly resolves itself later. It creates a permanent one, sitting there indefinitely unless someone in Washington specifically acts to undo it. And a partial deal, an agreement in principle without every detailed provision actually finalized and signed before 1 minute past midnight on the 19th, provides no protection whatsoever. The tariffs do not pause themselves out of professional courtesy while lawyers finish drafting the fine print. They activate automatically on schedule, regardless of how close the two sides say they are. That is the trap sitting at the very center of this entire story right now. Every single person directly involved in these negotiations, from LeBlanc to Charette to Greer, and ultimately Trump and Carney themselves, has a rational incentive to land a deal. Nobody involved actually benefits from a full-blown tariff collision that damages both economies simultaneously. And yet, the mechanics of Section 338 mean that being close, being cautiously optimistic, having constructive and detailed meetings, none of that actually matters if the final signature does not land in time. There is no partial credit built into this specific tariff mechanism. There is only signed or not signed before the clock runs out, which is exactly why this week's meetings carry a different kind of weight than the ones that came before them. This is not a routine check-in between two career trade officials keeping a relationship warm over the summer. This is two governments racing an actual specific, non-negotiable legal deadline, while simultaneously managing a trust deficit created by their own recent history together, the Gordie Howe Bridge renegotiation, the USMCA exemptions that simply got ignored, a Canadian Prime Minister who said publicly, on the record, that he needs to be convinced any agreement is worth the paper it is written on. And that sentiment, more than any single tariff percentage, is what is making the 7 days ahead feel so heavy in rooms where nobody is willing to say anything on the way out. So here is where things actually stand today, as close to real time as the available information allows. LeBlanc and Charette met with Greer on Tuesday for a full hour, walked out saying almost nothing to reporters, a silence that in this specific context reads as a sign of delicate, still unfinished progress rather than a signal that talks have collapsed. Sources have told multiple Canadian news outlets that both sides are right now working toward presenting an actual layout of a deal directly to President Trump, possibly as early as sometime this week before the August 19th deadline arrives. Specific concrete trade-offs are reportedly on the table across all three contested sectors, autos, alcohol, and dairy, though none have been publicly confirmed as fully agreed. 7 days remain. $20 billion in Canadian exports sit directly in the path of a 50% tariff that does not expire on its own once it activates. 3. Separate proclamations, already signed, already legally binding, are simply waiting for the clock to run out unless something changes them before then. And whatever gets presented to Donald Trump in the coming days, whatever specific combination of removed counter tariffs, loosened alcohol restrictions, and adjusted dairy quotas eventually lands on his desk, will need his direct personal signature to actually stop what has already been set in motion. Nothing about that process is automatic. Nothing about it is guaranteed. The meetings continue. The clock keeps running. And somewhere in Washington this week, a stack of paper representing months of careful, difficult, politically dangerous negotiation is being prepared for a desk where the man sitting behind it has already told the country on the other side of that table on national television that he does not particularly need them at all.